waiting.
How do you pronounce your first name, Angelo?
Yeah, it's Angelo.
Angelo.
It's correct. Yeah.
Just putting here in the chat, this is the link of your talk if you want to share with other people.
We are already online, live.
Mm-hmm.
So hi all.
Você tá mutado. Não, agora dá para ver.
So you can start now. We are back for the second public talk of the day. I am Angelo Pinto from the graduate program in entomology of Federal University of Paraná. And this event is part of our internationalization program, Print Capes. Dr. Pedro Dias will be hosting the talk in this afternoon. Pedro, please. So I will go to the background. Bye.
Bye, Angelo. Thank you. I'd like to introduce you guys to Dr. Ward Wheeler. He's a researcher in the American Museum of Natural History in New York and one of the most prestigious scientists in the field of phylogenetic systematics. And he's going to give us a talk about graphs, connections, and different cladograms and things in phylogenetics. So thank you, Ward, for accepting participating in this. And please, you may start the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Pedro and Angelo, for setting this up for me. I'm looking forward to this very much, and hello to everyone out there in the ether. Today, I'm going to talk about, as Pedro said, graphs, supergraphs, and phylogenetic networks. The idea here that we're going to talk about not just trees, but more general phylogenetic graphs, as you can see from these two title slides, that might include things like networks or multi-rooted objects or forests or things like that. And the basic topic of this talk is how we can take these different types of graphs and how can we make summaries, analogous to things like consensus trees, but in a more general context, and then how we might use those to either summarize results or use them as initial things or initial objects to start further research from initial results. So basically the way the talk is going to be organized is that I want to go through the motivation. So why would we want to talk about phylogenetic graphs or things other than trees, and why would we want to put them together and take them apart? The second step would be some definition. So we make sure that we're all on the same page with when we're talking about T or G or E or V or whatever we're talking about, that we all can understand that. And then some common steps that are involved in the very different, I'm going to talk about 6 different methods of putting things together, and so the common steps that exist among them. And then the crux of the talk is going to be looking and talking about vertex-based methods and edge-based methods. These are the two classes of reconciliation, graph reconciliation techniques. One that's focused on the nodes, the vertices of the graph you have, and one which is focused on the edges or the branches of the graphs we have. I should say right now, one thing I want to apologize for ahead of time is that I'm very inconsistent with my use of the word vertex or node. They mean the same thing. So I'll say leaf or taxon, they mean the same thing. And edges and branches are the same things also, but I go back and forth, unfortunately, between the terminology. The next thing I'll talk about is the complexity, basically the time complexity of constructing these objects. They may have, in some cases, over 100,000 edges in some cases I've worked on. So you have to talk about the time complexity to see how long these things are going to take, how things scale. And then a few empirical examples from different sorts of data sets and how you look at these different things, what do the results look like? And then the utility. So how can we, what's the purpose of these objects? How can we use these objects in our research programs? And so now, since nobody can stop me and ask a question, I'll just dive right in. The first thing I want to say is acknowledge collaborator Michael Miyagi, who's now at Harvard University at the Department of Organism and Evolutionary Biology. He was an REU student, research undergraduate student at the AIM&H a couple of years ago. And Michael did the initial work here on the edge union networks that was part of the motivation for expanding these techniques into other areas. So the motivation. Now, traditionally, we've talked about consensus techniques. These have been used to identify common and disparate information among trees, producing other trees. So you input trees, you output trees. And so there are many techniques, and we're probably all familiar with a lot of these things. For instance, the strict consensus of Shu and Polemus, although other people often cite a later paper. It actually, to my knowledge, comes from Shu and Polemus 1980. And that has the groups present in all the trees. So it's strict, it is restrictive, conservative, but it tells you what's present everywhere. Adams 2, Adams 1972. I say Adams 2 because there are actually two different consensus techniques in Adams' paper. The Adams 1 and Adams 2. When people say Adams, they really mean the second one. The first one, although very interesting, has the somewhat unfortunate property of sometimes promoting internal vertices, or HTUs, into leaves or OTUs. So it's not happy with, people aren't really happy with that for good reason. The Adams 2 has another property, which is it can basically turn paraphyletic groups into monophyletic groups via this intersection of groups things. And that's one of the reasons why Adams trees are not usually used to present as summaries, but they can be useful objects. I'm not going to talk about them that much, but the code that I talk about here actually has Adams in there if anyone's interested in exploring it. The next is Nelson, from Nelson's famous or infamous paper in 1979. It's been, when people say Nelson trees, they're often confused. The paper is, like Gary, brilliant and confusing and all over the place. And there are multiple techniques with elements of the strict consensus, majority consensus, and semi-strict consensus, all buried in that paper. But I think it's a great paper and has a lot of really wonderful ideas in it that other people really followed up on later on. The very familiar majority rule consensus, where groups are present in a majority of trees. It has to be 50% plus to get a tree. We don't have that restriction what I'm going to talk about here. We can actually have lower thresholds. And the last is semi-strict or consistent components, combinable components consensus, Bremer 1990. So those are some typical tree techniques. You input a tree and you output a tree. Now there are other ones that exist in the literature, other consensus techniques that can result in reduced trees or non-trees. And by reduced trees, what I mean is that there are things, leaves or taxa present in the inputs that are not present in the output. And one of them is a minimally pruned tree. I've actually seen this idea come up at least 5 or 6 different times in meetings and papers. The idea being, well, let's suppose you have a wild card taxon with very little data or something like that, or a lot of missing data, and it goes in many, many places, but the rest of the tree is really stable. So if you could prune out that one taxon, you get a stable result, and that's very satisfying, especially, for instance, if you're working with, say, paleontological data sets. The problem with it is that it's an NP-hard calculation in the sense that it's combinatorially explosive potentially. Also, you may have different solutions. Pruning different taxa may get you to a stable solution, and they're not unique. And of course, you lose taxa also as well. Another one, which is mainly in the mathematical literature, called maximum agreement forests. They're very useful objects mathematically, things like SPR and TBR distance. In this case, you remove components until a stable forest is found. So it's analogous to minimally pruned if you sort of put them aside. And you can see in the figure here, you have a couple of groups that disagree. So you pull out all the components that agree, and you get this forest of grass or trees in the bottom that have all the taxa in all the inputs, or all the leaves in all the inputs, but not necessarily contained in the same connected graph. They're in a forest here. And we'll use that technique later on with some of the edge-based techniques. Now, supertrees, I wanted to say this. So the idea of a supertree is different from a consensus in the sense that supertrees allow different taxon and leaf complements to be reconciled. So you can think of consensus as a special case where you have the same leaf complement in every input graph or tree. Supertrees are graph-based methods in general. That's the only one I'll talk about here, where you take, it's basically generalization of consensus, as I said. So for instance, the strict supertree, as you can see below, where you have 2 different input trees, and you have the groups A and B, which are present in both of them. C, D, and D, E are not. And so you get this supertree at the bottom, which represents all the groups present in all the inputs, and an irresolution for everything else. So that's an example of using supertrees. All the techniques I'm going to talk about today are really supergraphs, in the sense that you take multiple input graphs of general types. They do not have to have the same leaf complement, for that matter. They don't even have to be overlapping, really. And you output another supergraph. So another aspect of consensus that is not used that much, but we'll base ourselves on here, are networks as consensus. Now, normally consensus techniques input trees and output trees. But of course, you can input trees and output networks. Now, in these cases, the idea being that any disagreement just becomes extra edges that look like network edges. Now, there are several of these, and we're going to use some of them today to build on. So consensus cluster networks, the idea being that sort of every HTU, every vertex that's present is in all the inputs is put together, and you create lots of edges. We'll talk about that later. That's one of the basic ones we're going to build on. Things like cluster split networks, cluster union networks we're going to base on. Cluster split network, cluster union networks, and hybridization networks are all ways that one can add different edges to either reconcile the graphs in one way or another. Michael Miyagi, that I showed a picture of earlier, and myself talked about proposed the construction of the edge union network, where you take all the edges in all the input graphs and put them together, as comparing to the cluster union network. I misspoke earlier, sorry about that, where you take all the vertices that are common in all the input trees and put them together and reconstruct the edges. So these are the two techniques, cluster union networks and edge union networks, that we're going to work with here to generalize our notions of how we can create supergraphs. So let's talk about cluster union networks first. Baroni et al. 2005. All clusters or groups of leaves. So this would be a clade, a vertex in the sense of an HTU that would imply all its descendants of whatever structure. So just all its descendant leaves. Present in all the input trees as originally described. And they are collected, and edges and branches are created between clusters and their subclusters. Redundant arcs are filled out. So what this means is that you basically say, okay, take all the vertices in all the trees and label them with all their descendant taxa or leaves. All the ones, then you take and you create an edge or a branch between every vertex and every descendant vertex in all of them. So you get lots and lots of edges. Then you remove the redundant ones, as you see down below. So if you have an AC edge, you remove it if you also have an A, B, B, C. In the sense, if you can get to A to C without that direct AC edge, you remove that redundant arc. But that's based on this emphasis on the cluster, the internal vertices, the HTU vertices. That's really the focus of the cluster union network. Now, the edge union network takes an opposite focus, and that is on the edges or branches present in the input trees. It collects all of them, and then they are put together the same way the redundant arcs are removed, and so it's focused on the edges that you get there. Cluster union networks and edge union networks can produce different graphs. In general, cluster union networks produce more edges than do edge union networks. I'll show some examples. They're not the same thing. They can generate different results. Now I want to go into the definitions here. So we're going to talk about directed acyclic graphs, DAGs, not the kind from New Zealand, that consist of a set of vertices and edges. So a general graph is a pair of vertices, capital V, and edges, capital E. And of course, vertices are the internal nodes, and the edges are things that connect nodes. Now, in general, there are 4 types of vertices in these graphs because they're directed. Okay, we're not talking about unrooted things. You can have a root that has in degree, in other words, the number of branches coming in. There are no branches coming into root, so it has in degree 0, and it has some things going out, usually 2, but you can have it going out to 1 or more, and that's out degree greater than 0. You have a leaf or a terminal taxon with in degree greater than 0. It could usually 1 in most phylogenetic graphs, but you could have hybridizations or something like that, and an out degree 0, so the terminal, nothing comes out of them. You can have a tree vertex, which has an in degree 1, so 1 parent, and out degree greater than 1, more than 1 child, often 2, but it could be more. And then you have network vertices with in degree greater than 1, so they're coming together, like hybridization or something, and then out degree greater than 0, usually 1, but they could just be greater than 0. In general, vertices with in degree 1 and out degree 1 are contracted. You could think of them, that might be analogous to an ancestor in some sense, are contracted to remove them or just ignore it altogether. And in our definitions here, all edges are specified by a pair of vertices EU and are directed E to U. So E be the parent, U be the child. There are no self edges, so loops around yourself. And one point to mention here is that although in general it doesn't matter for the discussion here, phylogenetic network can be further restricted, basically in degree or out degree for vertex, for networks and trees must be 1 or 2, and since it leaves in 1 and out 0, and roots out 2 in 0. So that helps with the computational aspects of it, but it's not going to restrict what we're talking about here today. Where are we going here? Okay, sorry, I went ahead too far. Okay, so phylogenetic graphs. So here's some examples of phylogenetic graphs. So A in the top left, we see the familiar tree with 1 root, and we have a bunch of leaves, and we have children for each vertex and ancestors and so on and so forth. We can also have, as in B, we can have a network where we have, if you look at the ancestor of C, the parent of C, you have 2 nodes coming, 2 vertices or edges, sorry, coming together to create a network vertex whose single descendant is C. We can also have multi-rooted networks, which basically are that you have a, excuse me, you must have at least 1 network vertex, but you could have multiple roots. So the idea here being that, let's suppose you had, this is more probably represents lack of information than anything else, where you had things coming together that maybe a viral event between 2 different virus strains, but you really don't know where they come from, and so you can have a multi-rooted network. You can also have forests. So the top tree network and multi-root network are all completely connected, but you could have forests, as you see below, where you have some components of the forests are trees, some are derivative trees or networks or multi-root objects, all together forming a forest. So these are the sorts of phylogenetic graphs we want to deal with. In each case, they're directed, as you can see, from root to leaf, but they're all different kinds of things. Now, when we talk about phylogenetic supergraphs, we want to reconcile phylogenetic graphs of diverse types and leaf complements. So we're not going to restrict them to the same leaf complement. We're not going to restrict them to only trees. And as I said earlier, there are 2 basic approaches to this, at least in the way I'm dividing things up. The first is vertex-based, the second is edge-based. So on the left, we have a cluster union network where we've created, you can see there are some extra edges here. If you look at HTU7, HTU5 into E, you see there's a network connection there. If you look at the edge union network on the right, you also have HTU6, HTU10 going into HTU8. You have HTU7 and 9 going into B, but there are some connections between, let's say, 8 and that are present in the cluster union network that are not present in the edge union network based on different ways they're constructed, which I will now go into more detail. So now I'm going to talk about the steps to construct vertex-based and edge-based supergraphs. So there are several components that are common to all of them. The first is that we have a set of input forests. Okay, so with 1 or more components. Trees a forest, it's a derivative component, trivial forest, but nonetheless it's there. So we have inputs I, and that consists of a series of forests. Now the first thing we do is construct the total leaf set over all inputs. By this I mean the union of all the unique terminal taxa or leaves in all the inputs. Now the first sort of algorithmic step is that we need to attach to each leaf a unique label of bits. That is, and the number of bits is the number of leaves. Okay, so the length of the complete leaf set, and each leaf gets 1 bit on and all the other bits off, so we can represent it that way. This is a fairly common labeling system, not like I made this up. Each non-leaf vertex in each component of each forest is assigned a bit label created as the union of its descent vertices via post-order traversal. So post-order traversal is leaves to root. It's often called a down pass. I don't like to use that term because if you put the roots on top or to the left or the right, say down pass, up pass, doesn't really make much sense. So or it can be confusing. So post-order is from the leaves, A through F, down to the root. And you can see that each leaf has a unique set of labels. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. So they each get a unique set of, a unique bit is turned on, D there as well. That's why it seems like there are too many of them. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 leaves. Then you look at the descendants, which are the unions of like A and B. So you put both the ones on. If you look at E and F, you put the 2 ones on the end. And if you look at the label that's the ancestor of C, since that's an out degree 1 node, and each vertex has to have a unique label, and you simply prepend a 1 to that. So it increases the leaf set a bit. Sorry, the bit set a bit. But you have, the main thing here is that each vertex has a unique bit labeling, and that its descendants are all subsets of that bit labeling. Those are the key components of this. And so you can see we get down to the root where we have all 1s on, and that represents the complement of taxa that are present in all the descendants of that. So this is the first step. We do this for all the graphs. We have all these bit labelings. So now we have everything labeled uniquely in terms of bits. Now we're going to talk about the vertex-based threshold algorithm. Now I say threshold algorithm because we're going to include vertices and also a percentage, so you can have they're present in all the trees or any tree or a majority of them or something like that, or input graphs. So we want to say the vertex the vertex set here is the union of all vertices in all the input in the input forests where the frequency of that vertex is greater than some minimum. And actually it's more than just frequency, it's actually combinability. So we'll call it frequency for the moment, but it's a little more complex than that. So we create an initial edge set. So the first thing we do is we look at all the vertices that are present. Now, if we're talking about taking them all, we just take them all. If we say only those that are present everywhere, then F is 100. We only take those vertices by their unique bit label that are present in all the input graphs. Now, in the vertex-based system, we take this collection of vertices that are bit labeled, and then we create edges between each vertex and each other vertex whose bit label is a subset of that vertex, which means it is a descendant of that vertex. So for instance, if you look at the root and they're all on, there'll be an edge created from the root to every other vertex because all the other vertices are subsets of that vertex. So that's your initial edge set. And you can see it's going to be quite large, right? It's going to be on the order of v squared or something like that. Now you identify the redundant edges from the initial set as I mentioned earlier. So you go through all this operation where you check, oh, the bottom should be C. I apologize, that should be A to B and then A to C. So you have, you remove the A to C in every case where there is an A to B and a B to C. So you identify the redundant edges and you remove that then. So for every AC, if there exists edges A, B, and BC, you remove it. You create you create a set of redundant edges, and then you remove those redundant edges in the final step by subtracting the redundant edges from the initial set. Now, once you have your set of vertices and you have your set of edges, you have your graph. Okay, so you're in good shape there. You're done for the vertex-based threshold. Now, for an edge-based threshold algorithm, you can see it works in a very similar way. In the first case, you collect all the vertices present in a sufficient fraction. Sorry, that should say edges. I apologize. Collect all the edges present in a sufficient fraction of input graphs. So the idea being that you go through, instead of all the labeled vertices, now you have the edges, which are also bit labeled on each side, and they are uniquely labeled. So if you have the same edge in different graphs, you can recognize that. You collect all of those edges, and you, in the same way you corrected, or an analogous fashion to correcting all the vertices. You identify the redundant edges from the initial set with the same incorrectly labeled figure. I apologize again on the right. You do go through the same operation where you identify the redundant edges, AC from AB and BC, and then you identify the redundant edges. Then you create, now here's a little more complex step now. So you have all these edges, and the question is, which vertices do you need? So you create the vertex set via another post-order traversal from the leaf set unions of all vertices. And the idea being you take every leaf, you start there because they're out degree 0. And you go to its ancestors all the way, its parents, all the way to the root. And every time you touch a vertex, you put it in your pile of vertices that you want. So by going from all the leaf sets to potentially all the roots, there could be multiple roots if it's a multi-root object or if it's forest, you then collect all the vertices that you need. And so you have the vertex set is all those vertices in the input such that are within the set where there's a path between a leaf and at least one root. Now, the last thing here is you have to identify orphan edges, because you can imagine that one can have an edge that's not present in some set because of some frequency. And so it might be defined by vertices that are not in the final set, that are not part of any traversal. So you have to prune out or identify those orphan edges. So that would be like between two HTUs or two vertices that have no connection to anything else. Then you create the final edge set by subtracting the redundant and the orphan edges from the initial edge set. Again, now you have your vertex set, you have your edge set, you have your graph, you're ready to go, you're in good shape. So the first thing we want to talk about here is the complexity of this. So how long is it? What's the time complexity of these operations? And so for an input forest set F, unique vertex set VI, unique edge set EI from the inputs, the first stage is the vertex bit labeling, which would be an order of the number of edges in the graph, because you have to traverse the graph post order from the leaves to the root. Then you have to count all these vertices if you're going to do a threshold, right? You want to count how frequent they are, and if you're going to do that using sets, it would roughly be V log V. Edge creation, so you have to go through then and go back and create these edges between every vertex and its subset vertices or its descendants, and that's going to be roughly a V squared operation, because you'd have to look at every combination of vertices and see if an edge can be created or not. Then you have to identify the redundant edges. This is done by a breadth-first search to verify that when you remove an edge, that there still is a path between the two vertices that define that edge, and that's this operation here. It's the number of edges times the number of edges plus the number of vertices. The edge subtraction operation is a set operation that can be done relatively efficiently. It's roughly E log E, as you can see here, or E log factor. And so if you add in all these terms, you take the highest asymptotic time complexity terms, the vertex-based operation will be roughly dependent on, of course, the constant factor, the square of the vertex size, vertex set, the square of the size of the edge set, plus the product of the vertex and edge sets. That tells you roughly how long squared in vertices, squared in edges, and then the product of the two. The complexity of the edge-based sets is very similar, as you can see. The vertex bit labeling is the same. The edge counting is the same, but in terms of edges. The vertex creation of the post order is a little simpler, because instead of the squared term earlier of the vertices, you're really just doing post order passes. So that really is a linear process through over the edges of the tree, or the graph rather. The redundant edge identification operation by a breadth first search is the same as the previous operation in the vertex set, and the edge subtraction is the same sort of set-wise subtraction operation there. So the overall asymptotic complexity for the edge-based operations does not have that vertex squared term. It's edge squared plus the vertex times the number of vertices times the number of edges. If you look before, we had that extra VI term there. So in the sense of looking at these things, if you double the size of the graph, double the vertices, double the edges, things will get 4 times as much in both cases, really. But there's an extra factor of the V squared as well as a constant factor. So in general, one can imagine that the vertex operations will be a little more time complex than the edge-based operations. Now, just to show you some how, what does that mean in terms of actual operation time? Here, this comes from Michael Miyagi and my paper in 2019, and showing a bunch of different data sets where you can see input trees from 9 to 244, input edges from a low of about 600 to a high of about 120,000, and the number of redundant edges and so on and so forth. And then the clock time, you can see this can still be done relatively quickly. So even if you have 124,000 edges, the clock time in seconds was about 3 minutes. So it's not brutally bad. Now this is for the edge union network, and I'll explain how that folds into this, which is one of the most straightforward way to do this. And we just verify the time complexity with the input edge set and the runtime. So why do we take this perhaps over-involved way of describing these things? Well, the idea here is that we want to have a framework that we can then use to define other forms of consensus and clustering as subsets of that, or special cases. So if we take that threshold, that F factor in the vertex-based set, if the threshold is 0, in the sense that if a cluster is present anywhere, we always take it, we get the cluster union network. If we require that a vertex, basically a subtree, be present in more than half of the input trees, well, then that's the majority rule consensus for trees. If we require it in all of them, it's the strict consensus. So if we only use input trees, we have the same number of leaves, we set these values to these, the same leaf set rather, we set these values 0, 50, 100, we get the familiar cluster union network, majority rule consensus and strict consensus. Of course, with more complex graphs, you can get more complex objects. They're not necessarily going to be trees anymore. Now at the edge-based threshold, if we do the same kind of operation, if we set the threshold to 0, so any edge present in any group is part of the output, that's the edge union network that Michael Miyagi and I did. If we require that an edge be present in more than half of them, we get the majority edge forest, because we're going to probably lose things. So the vertex-based methods are going to give us a single connected graph. The edge-based methods are not necessarily. We can have forests as outputs. The edge union network will always be, for a network input will be, tree inputs will be network, a single connected network. But once you get to these threshold values of either greater than half, or in fact requiring to be in all of them, like a strict edge forest, you can get unconnected objects, and you often do get unconnected objects. And that's a way that we can look at analogous to a minimum prune network, minimum prune trees, to pull out things like wildcat taxa. And so they can be useful in that way. So an example here, we have 4 input graphs. As you can see, we have a network in the lower right. We have some trees in the other ones. They have different sets of taxa and so on and so forth. And so we put those together, and we get this rather elaborate output here. So on the top 3 are vertex-based methods. The bottom 3 are edge-based methods. And so on the top left, we have the vertex-based with threshold 0. So that's the cluster union network. And you can see you get these various network inputs. B has 3 inputs into it in degree 3, but others have, smaller ones, and so on and so forth. D only has 1 ancestor, and C has 3. If we look at creating a threshold of the vertices to 51%, well, now we get the input is a majority rule consensus. And so you've lost these network edges, and you have a more familiar majority rule consensus. We make the vertex-based threshold 100 on the top right, and we get what's basically a strict consensus of the inputs. It is in fact a strict consensus of the inputs. It's a strict consensus supertree. Now we look at the edge-based methods. If we look at the lower right, that's the edge union network when threshold is 0, published earlier. If we say we require that these edges be present in more than half of the inputs, E, the one on the left-hand side of the lower group, we see that we've now pulled out A and B, because A and B's positions or connections to other members of the graph is unstable. It's not present in half. And so they get pulled out. So you have this forest now saying A and B are sort of wild cards, and all the rest of them have structure together. And then if you say, well, what's the structure present when all of the edges must be, when an edge was present in all the inputs, you can see, at least in this case, that there's no shared grouping information there. It's just saying, okay, it's all a forest. These things are floating all over the place. So we can use this to examine things like wild cards, or a different way of looking at taxa that have unstable positions. Now I'll do a couple of, talk about some empirical examples here. So we have Bantu language data set, and that was done with Peter Whiteley and Ming Shui. Heteropteran data set with Cristiano Weirach, Toby Shu, and Jerry Cassie. Metazoan data set and archaeal data sets that were collected for a paper, actually originally with Gonzalo Giribet, and then later with Eric Ford. And then the Spider Tree of Life paper, Gustavo Ormiga standing in for about 20 other authors. So you can see the different variety of data sets, and also what's the leaf size. We have 100 or so for Bantu languages, and a heteropteran data set. The Metazoan, archaeal, and Iranian data sets go from 200 to 600 to almost 1,000 taxa. And there are different sorts of inputs. So for the Bantu languages, we actually had different sort of sensitivity analysis assumptions of different ways languages can evolve. For the heteropteran data set, we had 4 different input data sets that had different leaf complements because of missing data. The Metazoan data set is actually one consistent thing that's just sort of larger. Same with the archaeal data set. The spider data set also has a patchwork of missing data, and this was from about, I think, 6 or 7 input locus trees. Now, I'm not going to show all of them, but I want to just summarize them. At first, you have the cluster union network, the majority consensus, the strict consensus, the edge union network, majority union network, and strict union network. So these are the vertices on top, the edge base in the bottom, going from thresholds of 0, 50, and 100%. So we have input trees in the hundreds. And so the main thing about this is that you can see that the number of vertices and edges, for instance, in the spider data set, is almost 160,000 edges and almost 80,000 nodes. So these things get very big, and I won't show the biggest ones because they look like spaghetti, but they're very useful for pulling things out. You can pull things out from the outputs and say, okay, what's behaving consistently, what's not behaving consistently. And I'll show a few examples of this. So these are the Bantu language data sets. On the top, you have the cluster union network, the root of the trees at the top. So these are sort of all over the place, but more at the bottom. And you can see here that all the different connections of the leaves that are made. And these are among, so this is reconciling 6 different vowel consonant models and how they imply different sorts of things. As you can see, the base of the tree is relatively stable, and there are some clades at the top right, middle, and center and left that are relatively stable throughout all the different analyses, but you can see there are large groups here that have a lot of instability. The edge union net will look very similar with this large data set and has other property. We can see, again, stable at the base and a few clades that are stable, but a lot of stuff going on in the middle. Now, if we look at these different sorts of other things, so the majority rule consensus in the top here, you can see there's more, you can tell where the structure ends, right? Is this node here, and then the top groups here that have the same structure, those are the ones that showed they were coming out in the previous analysis. And the strict consensus shows a subset of those as having present all the inputs. When we look at the majority and the strict edge union networks, you can see that you get these forests that have smaller groupings. So these are the stable groups. We can look at it that way. And then when you look at the strict, there are very few that are common, or really only sister pairs of 2 or 3 or 4 languages that go together. When we look at the heteropteran data set, we have a similar pattern, but less mess with the cluster union network. You see more islands of stability in different sorts of taxa. With the edge union network, you have more edges, but you can see also that there are different areas where there's agreement and disagreement. Part of this is also the idea is to ferret out, well, when can you have horizontal transfer? And I'll talk a little about that in a minute, is you can identify these edges as potential evidence of hybridization or horizontal transfer, and then test them individually. Again, for the majority rule, the strict consensus, the majority edge union network and strict edge union network, can see that you get different levels of structure in these things and almost no structure in the common edge union network for that data set. Now, I'm not going to show the more complex ones. The bigger data sets just really can't see anything. You really have to analyze them numerically. But the idea here is that we've identified edges that could potentially be regarded as hybridization nodes or horizontal transfer, things like that, with these different sorts of ways of looking at them. So what's the utility of this? Well, the first benefit is we have a unified framework for graph reconciliation. We can take any kind of graph, pretty much, any kind of directed phylogenetic graph, put them together, and under different sorts of emphases, create new graphs that we can use to either put them together and make sense of them all together, or use them as sort of analyses. So these can serve as a summary of analyses. Well, this is what's common information or not common information for all of our results. And the last is that you can actually take all these things, put them together, and say, okay, what's non-tree-like? Where is it non-tree-like? Let's look at those areas of the graph. What are the data doing? Do we have evidence of things like horizontal transfer, or is it simple homoplazy, or what's going on there? So these sorts of graphs can be either the summary, the end of analysis, or can start as the start of analyses for looking at different kinds of potentially evolutionary events. One last thing here, all the code that's produced in this is all open source and available on GitHub, and so that's all available to anybody who wants to use it. I'll be publishing this, hopefully, and submit this in the next couple of months, so that's in good shape. And the last thing I want to do is acknowledge Pedro and Angelo for setting all this sort of stuff up, and these funding agencies for funding this research, including DARPA, the Kleberg Foundation, and the American Museum of Natural History. And thank you all for your attention. Hopefully I won't screw this up now as I transfer to, let's see here. I'm going to go to the Microsoft Teams now. Is that right, Pedro?
Yes. Thank you very much, Ward, for participating and for this amazing talk. And for all the people, the participants, the subscribers subscribed in the event, Now we're going to go to the Microsoft Teams. Ward going to be joining us. It's the meeting that says part 2. Some people, they're having problems with the software and they're creating new meetings, but we're just going to use the meeting with the name part 2. Ward is going to be joining us there, and you're going to be able to ask him questions. Thank you, Ward, once again.
Thanks, Pedro. Am I in the right place now?
Yeah, let me see. Well, we can end up the